It was the night of March 31st, 2006, in Columbus, Ohio. A young medical student stepped into a crowded bar, smiling, waving, and vanishing into the noise of the city. Security cameras recorded him walking in, but never walking out. To this day, no one knows what happened next. Brian Shaffer seemed to disappear into thin air, right in front of hundreds of people. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old, a second-year medical student at Ohio State University. Friends described him as witty, ambitious, and easygoing, the kind of person who could turn strangers into friends with just a smile. He had a passion for music, especially Pearl Jam, and he often dreamed about starting a band of his own someday. But behind his charm, Brian's life was heavy with recent loss. Just weeks earlier, his mother, Renee, had died after a long battle with cancer. Those close to him said her death left him shaken, though he tried to mask his pain with humor. Still, the future seemed bright. He was weeks away from finishing another grueling semester, and he and his girlfriend Alexis were planning a spring getaway to Miami. By all appearances, Brian was a young man with everything to live for. Yet within days, his name would become synonymous with one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in American history, a case that continues to haunt his family, confound investigators, and baffle internet sleuths across the world. That Friday evening began quietly. Brian had dinner with his father, Randy, at a local steakhouse. They spoke about Brian's future, about Alexis, and about the long hours he'd been putting into his studies. Nothing about that conversation hinted that this would be the last time Randy would ever see his son. Later that night, Brian met up with his friend William Clint Florence to blow off steam after a week of exams. The two bar-hopped their way through the university district, laughing, drinking, and eventually making their way to the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a popular bar tucked inside a second-story corner of the Gateway shopping complex. The atmosphere inside was typical for a late Friday in Columbus, crowded, loud, filled with music and flashing lights. Dozens of students pressed shoulder to shoulder, shouting conversations over the speakers. Brian, with his tall frame and easy smile, stood out as he made his way through the crowd. Around 2 a.m., security cameras captured him outside the bar's entrance, chatting briefly with two young women. He looked relaxed, waving his hands animatedly as he spoke. Then, just minutes later, the footage showed him walking back inside the bar. From that moment, Brian Shaffer was never seen again. Friends assumed he'd slipped into the crowd, maybe gone to the restroom, maybe even stepped outside for air. But when the lights came on and the Ugly Tuna emptied out for the night, Brian was nowhere to be found. His phone, his credit cards, and his bank account would show no activity from that night forward. A young man had walked into a bar at closing time and simply ceased to exist. When police began reviewing the security footage from that night, what they discovered only deepened the mystery. The Ugly Tuna Saloona had multiple cameras positioned at the entrance, designed to capture everyone who came in and out of the bar. On the tape, Brian is seen clearly. He arrives with his friend Clint. He's spotted speaking with two women near the escalator, and then he heads back inside the bar just before closing time. But in hours of footage that followed, not once does Brian appear walking out. Every patron who entered that night was accounted for, except him. Detectives rewound the tape, slowed it down frame by frame. Searching for any glimpse of Brian slipping past the lens, they checked every angle, every second of footage. Still, there was no sign of him. It was as if the bar had swallowed him whole. Investigators considered other possibilities. There was a service exit used by employees, but it was tightly monitored. Could Brian have sneaked out through a back stairwell or service corridor? Perhaps. But if so, where did he go? And then came the most unsettling question of all. If Brian had left the bar unnoticed, why did no camera, anywhere in the surrounding Gateway complex, capture him afterward? Police canvassed the area, reviewed footage from neighboring businesses, even searched parking garages and street cameras. Nothing. Brian Shaffer walked into the Ugly Tuna Saloona, but there was no proof he ever walked out. When Brian failed to return home that night, at first no one panicked. Friends assumed he might have crashed at someone's apartment or simply stayed out late. But when he missed a planned trip with his girlfriend Alexis, alarm bells rang. Alexis called his phone again and again. Each time it went straight to voicemail. Over the next several days, her messages grew more desperate. "Brian, please call me back. Just let me know you're okay." Brian's father, Randy, immediately sensed something was wrong. After losing his wife only weeks earlier, he couldn't imagine also losing his son. He called police, filed a report, and began printing missing person posters with Brian's smiling face. Columbus, a city filled with tens of thousands of college students, suddenly became the center of a desperate search. Brian's younger brother, Derek, felt a crushing weight of dread. He replayed every recent conversation with Brian, wondering if there had been a hidden clue, some warning sign he had missed. Meanwhile, Brian's friends struggled with guilt. Clint, the friend who had gone out with him that night, admitted he didn't know where Brian had gone after they separated in the bar. He thought Brian had just left early. None of them realized they were living the last moments of his known life. By the end of that first week, the Shaffer family's worst fears were taking shape. Brian hadn't contacted anyone, hadn't touched his bank accounts, and hadn't shown up at school. His life had simply stopped. The young man who once dreamed of beaches in Miami and a career in medicine was now the subject of flyers plastered across Columbus. Missing, Brian Shaffer, age 27, last seen at Ugly Tuna Saloona. The Columbus Division of Police quickly realized this was no ordinary missing person case. Most adults who disappear are located within days. Often they've left voluntarily, or a trail of activity shows where they've gone. But Brian Shaffer's trail ended the second he stepped into that bar. Detectives launched a full-scale investigation. They interviewed bar staff, patrons, and the two women Brian was last seen speaking to. They swept the Ugly Tuna from top to bottom: kitchens, storage rooms, utility spaces, even the crawl spaces above the ceiling tiles. There was no sign of Brian. Search dogs were brought in. Divers were sent into the Olentangy River, which flows just blocks away from the bar. Officers canvassed nearby parking garages, rooftops, and alleyways. Still, nothing. The lack of evidence baffled investigators. There were no signs of foul play, no blood, no struggle. It was as if Brian had simply vanished into another dimension. Early on, detectives floated several theories. One was that Brian had slipped out of the bar undetected, perhaps through a service exit, and met with an accident on the way home. But no body ever surfaced. Another possibility was voluntary disappearance. Some speculated Brian had decided to walk away from his life, devastated by his mother's death. Maybe he wanted a fresh start somewhere far away. But would a man who adored his family, who was days away from a trip with his girlfriend, really abandon everything without a word? A third, darker theory soon emerged, that Brian had been the victim of foul play, possibly lured outside the bar, attacked, and hidden before anyone could notice. But with no witnesses and no evidence, the theory remained speculation. What made investigators lose sleep was the surveillance footage. The entrance camera showed everyone, staff, customers, delivery workers, leaving the bar. Every single face could be identified, every movement tracked. Except for Brian's, it was impossible. And yet, it was the only fact they had. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation into Brian Shaffer's disappearance produced more questions than answers. Every new lead seemed to dissolve into nothing, leaving investigators and his family trapped in uncertainty. Not long after Brian went missing, reports began to surface of possible sightings. A woman in Texas claimed she had seen him at a mall. Another tip came from Atlanta, where someone swore a man resembling Brian had been spotted playing guitar on the street. Each time, police followed up. Interviews, photos, surveillance checks, but every tip ended the same way. It wasn't Brian. Then came the strangest twist. In September 2006, months after Brian vanished, his phone rang. Alexis, his girlfriend, was the one who noticed. For a brief moment, her heart raced with hope. The call pinged off a cell tower near Hilliard, a small town outside Columbus. Investigators rushed to trace it, but by the time they arrived, the signal was gone. Whether it was a glitch, a pocket dial, or something else entirely, no one could explain it. The mystery deepened online. Amateur sleuths pored over the surveillance footage, analyzing shadows, reflections, even the way people moved in and out of the bar. Some claimed Brian disguised himself and slipped out unnoticed. Others whispered about secret tunnels in the Gateway complex. And then came the darker whispers, organized crime. Some theorized Brian had crossed paths with the wrong people, drug dealers, gangs, or even someone inside the bar itself. With no evidence to confirm or deny it, the rumors only grew louder. Perhaps most unsettling was the silence from Brian's closest circle. His friend Clint, the last person to see him alive, refused to take a polygraph test when asked by police. Clint insisted he had told them everything he knew, but his refusal left a shadow of suspicion that has lingered for years. For Brian's father, Randy, the swirl of theories and dead ends was torture. "I just want to know what happened to my son," he told reporters. "Anything. I just want the truth." For Brian's father, Randy Shaffer, the search for his son became the single driving force of his life. He poured his energy into handing out flyers, speaking with reporters, and pleading with the public for information. He chased every rumor, no matter how small, hoping that just one would bring him closer to Brian. But the weight of loss was already crushing. Brian's mother, Renee, had died only weeks before he vanished. Now, with her gone and Brian missing, Randy felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. His younger son, Derek, carried his own burden of grief. At times, Derek admitted, he felt like he had already lost his whole family. Family gatherings were no longer the same. Holidays, birthdays, dinners, there was always an empty chair at the table. Alexis, Brian's girlfriend, continued to call his phone for months after he vanished. Sometimes it rang, sometimes it went straight to voicemail, but she left messages anyway, her voice cracking with the same plea. "Please, Brian, just let us know you're alive." Then, in 2008, tragedy struck again. A freak storm ripped through rural Ohio, toppling power lines and destroying homes. Among the casualties was Brian's father, Randy, who was killed when a branch fell on him outside his home. At his funeral, mourners gathered not only to grieve Randy, but also to face the unspoken truth. The man had died without ever knowing what happened to his son. Beside his headstone, a space was left empty, reserved for Brian, in the hope that someday he might return. For Derek, the younger brother, the pain grew sharper. "I've lost both my parents," he said, "and my brother. It feels like I'm the only one left." The Shaffer family's heartbreak was a wound that never healed. Each passing year carried the same unanswered questions, the same gnawing silence. To them, Brian was more than a cold case file. He was a son, a brother, a fiancé, and he was still missing. The reason was simple. The case had all the elements of a haunting puzzle. A young man with a bright future, a grainy security tape, and the chilling question of how someone could vanish in plain sight. On forums like Web Sleuths and Reddit's Unsolved Mysteries, thousands of amateur detectives picked apart every detail. They tracked timelines, drew maps of the bar, and even theorized about hidden exits and construction tunnels. Some users replayed the surveillance footage frame by frame, convinced they spotted a shadow, a reflection, or a movement that police had overlooked. The theories ranged from the plausible to the bizarre. Some argued Brian slipped away to start a new life, perhaps in mourning, perhaps to escape the weight of medical school. Others believed he had been murdered inside the bar and that his body was hidden in a way investigators had missed. A few speculated about human trafficking, while others leaned toward the supernatural, as if Brian had simply blinked out of existence. Television networks soon joined the obsession. Shows like America's Most Wanted and later numerous true crime podcasts dedicated episodes to Brian's case. Each retelling pulled in new audiences. Each detail reignited the same question. How does someone just vanish without a trace? For some, Brian's smile in the security footage became a symbol of unanswered loss, a reminder that behind every unsolved case is a family waiting, still hoping. But media attention cut both ways. While it kept Brian's name alive, it also stirred frustration. Police were overwhelmed with false tips and conspiracy theories. The family had to endure endless speculation, sometimes cruel, sometimes wildly inaccurate, about what might have happened that night. Still, the fascination never faded. Year after year, Brian Shaffer's name remained at the top of America's most baffling disappearances, a case that seemed to taunt investigators and the public alike with its lack of answers. After the media frenzy quieted, what remained was silence. Year after year passed without a single confirmed sighting, without a shred of new evidence. Brian's bank accounts remained untouched. His phone never lit up again. His apartment sat frozen in time, filled with medical textbooks and Pearl Jam posters, waiting for an owner who never returned. Each April, when the anniversary came, small vigils were held. Friends gathered with candles, telling stories about Brian, clinging to the image of the carefree, guitar-playing student they once knew. But beneath the glow of candlelight was the heavy truth. No one was any closer to knowing what happened that night. The theories, however, refused to fade. Some still believed Brian had chosen to vanish, that grief from his mother's death had driven him to escape. But skeptics asked, how could a man disappear so cleanly, with no money, no passport, no plan? Others clung to the foul play theory. Did someone lure Brian into a trap that night? Was his body hidden somewhere in or near the bar, missed in the early searches? Some detectives admitted privately that the possibility haunted them. And then there were those who thought the answer lay somewhere in between, a freak accident, a moment of poor judgment that spiraled into tragedy. Perhaps Brian had slipped out an unmonitored back route, only to meet a deadly fate in the dark streets beyond. But without evidence, every theory was just another story built on shadows. The cruelest part was the lack of closure. Families of the missing often say that not knowing is worse than death, that every phone call, every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face on the street sparks a flicker of hope. For the Shaffer family, that flicker never died, even as the years stretched on. And so the questions lingered, unanswered, hanging in the air like smoke. Did Brian Shaffer walk away from his life? Was he taken against his will? Or did something unexplainable happen inside that bar on that rainy spring night? No one could say. And that silence, that lack of truth, became the most haunting detail of all. The disappearance of Brian Shaffer endures not only because of its mystery, but because of what it represents. The terrifying possibility that anyone, anywhere, can vanish without explanation. Brian wasn't a drifter or a runaway. He was a medical student with a future, a girlfriend, a family, and plans that extended far beyond a single night in a college bar. His case defied logic, and that's what made it unforgettable. In Columbus, his story became a warning whispered to new students. Don't walk alone. Don't take safety for granted. Online, his name became a fixture in true crime communities, a symbol of the unresolved, sparking thousands of theories and debates. For his girlfriend Alexis, for his brother Derek, and for the extended family that loved him, the pain never softened. Every birthday passed without a phone call, every holiday marked by an empty chair. Even years later, Alexis admitted she still dreamed about Brian, dreams where he walked into the room, smiling as if no time had passed. What keeps this case alive isn't just the footage of Brian waving outside the bar, or the unanswered ping of a cell tower months later. It's the silence that followed. It's the cruel emptiness of not knowing. The disappearance of Brian Shaffer is one of those rare cases where the absence of answers is the story. The very impossibility of it all ensures that his name will be spoken again and again until either the truth is found or time itself buries the mystery. More than 15 years have passed since the night Brian Shaffer vanished. His friends grew older, his classmates graduated, and the city of Columbus moved on. But for his family, and for those who still search his name online, time has stood still. The last image of Brian remains frozen in grainy black and white security footage. A young man smiling, waving, then stepping back inside a bar, only to never be seen again. What happened after that moment is a question that has haunted investigators, friends, and strangers across the world. Did Brian choose to disappear? Did he meet with foul play? Or is there an explanation still buried beneath the noise of that rainy night in 2006? Perhaps one day, someone will come forward with the missing piece. Until then, Brian's story lingers, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are the ones without answers. What do you think happened to Brian Shaffer? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you want to keep these stories alive, so the names of the missing are never forgotten, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Silent Traces. More unsolved mysteries are waiting, and together we'll keep searching for the truth.